I can speak it out. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today for this Henry Hammond lecture. Thank you to Stephen and Farnham Town Council Craft Study Centre for inviting me to deliver this lecture. It's a privilege to speak about the life and enduring legacy of Ladi Dosei Kwali, Nigeria's most celebrated potter, whose artistry continues to shape the histories of ceramics, craft, and modernism across continents. When I began researching Kwali's work about a decade ago now, I was struck by a paradox. In Nigeria, her name is visible, particularly in the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, and in her hometowns of Kwali and Suleja. On roads, street signs, conference centers, and her image is printed on the reverse of the Nigerian 20 naira note, where she's throwing on a potter's wheel, which colonial encounter, global circulation. Asks us to see clay not as medium alone, but as method, a way of thinking, resisting, and remembering. Ladi Kwali learned not from her mother, but her aunt, an exceptional gift of hand building, for which she was recognized. Oral histories describe how by her late teens, she was already known and her pots sold out across local markets. It was said that her pots sold out before reaching the town. She worked in the Gbari hand-building tradition, beginning with a solid lump of clay, drawing upward into shape by hand without the potter's wheel. Each pot was built in conversation with gravity, balance, and intuition. The surfaces were decorated with ruler-impressed and incised motifs, echoing Gbari women's body markings, geometric tattoos that linked vessel and body, skin and surface. These designs made the pots not just utilitarian, but deeply symbolic vessels that, as I mentioned before, held water, food, and an identity as well of the Gbari people. By the 1950s, Kwali's fame had spread far beyond her village. Her pots had reached the palace of the Emir of Abuja, Alhaji Suleiman Barrow, where they caught the attention of Michael Cardew, who, as everybody in this room and most people know, is a famous British studio potter who began working for the Nigerian colonial government in the 1950s. Cardew founded the Abuja Training Pottery Center in 1952 as part of the colonial policy of development through craft. And his aim there was to train young men in wheel throwing and high temperature glazing, introducing industrial efficiency to what was seen as local peasants' crafts. Into this deeply gendered colonial framework entered Ladi Kwali in 1954. So this is an image of one of the buildings in the Pottery Training Center, the sales room, I believe, which was taken by Doig Simmons in the 1950s. Cardew, struck by Kwali's skill, was persuaded by the emir to join the training center. She was the first woman, the only hand builder among male trainees using the wheel. These photographs taken by Doig Simmons capture her. One of them captures her standing before the kiln, calm and assured, with a water pot by her feet. She brought into that space an alternative knowledge system, tactile, intuitive, indigenous, and in doing so, she quietly transformed it. Under Kardew's supervision, Kwali began to create stoneware pots, glazing chons, celadons, tenmokus. These were glazing techniques foreign to her, but she absorbs them with remarkable adaptability, merging Gbari traditional form with European pottery techniques. The result was a hybrid aesthetic, an alchemy of traditions, as evident in her water pots, particularly, as we see here today, live in this room. But in these portraits, we see composure, a woman who carried herself with pride, confident, and someone who was approaching clay. And her work asked us to use clay, asked us to see clay, not just as a medium, but as a method, a way of thinking, resisting, and remembering. Here we see examples of these works, a hand-built Gbari form, but coated in a translucent glaze that pulls around the incised decoration. The other pot from the Craft Studies Center collection, from the University of the Creative Art collection, is a terracotta demonstration pot made here in Farnham, low-fired and unglazed. An early example of our work that retained memory of touch, the coiling beneath with the coiling remaining visible, even in the glaze example next to it. In these works, the tension between use and display, craft and art becomes palpable. The vessels no longer serve domestic life as they were bound for exhibitions in London and beyond. At the present moment, one of them is in New York, as Stephen mentioned, on display at the Ford Foundation Gallery, and others on display, part of the Nigerian Modernism exhibition at Tate Modern, Ladi Kwali being written into a narrative of modernism, expanded narrative of modernism within African art, which wasn't the case previously. Kwali's artistry transcends categorization. She became, in effect, Nigeria's first transnational ceramic modernist, though not in the way art history usually defines the term. Her modernism was tactile, embodied, rooted in indigenous epistemology. Still, we must not romanticize this encounter. The Abuja Pottery Training Center was also a site of asymmetry. Kardew's writings reveal a paternalistic tone. He admired Kwali's natural gift, but framed her within a language of native craft. She was paid less than her male peers because pay was tied to formal schooling, which she lacked. And yet, when you watch footage of her working, you see evident her authority. She moves with precision. As she both builds and decorates surfaces of pots, she knew what clay could do. By the late 1960s and 70s, Kwali had become a cultural ambassador of sorts. She traveled here to Britain, to the United States and Europe, demonstrating her craft to audiences who were fascinated by her skill. In 1972, she toured the US for nearly 3 months, demonstrating coiling techniques and as part of workshops at museums and educational institutions, including historically Black colleges and universities. In this photograph at a demonstration in Memphis, she's before a crowd, shaping clay with measured confidence. Her presence confounds expectation. An African woman potter center stage in the American South at the aftermath of the civil rights movement, not without its problematics. This image is in the Kwali family archives in Suleja. I was shown this photograph from her Memphis demonstration, one of very few surviving records that the family possess. Surrounded by American audiences, she appears at ease and confident. The photo was shown to me by her family member who said she brought her village with her at these demonstrations. These demonstrations were complex, part pedagogy, part performance, part diplomacy. They reflected a moment when post-colonial nations on the African continent, including Nigeria, sought to assert cultural sovereignty through culture and art, even as old hierarchies persisted here, with the Kadu Kwali power dynamics that clearly existed in such a context. It is both documentation and performance, the pot as pedagogical tool, the artist as conduit between worlds. To me, this image also embodies her enduring resonance. As a ceramic artist rooted in indigenous knowledge, yet speaking to global audiences through the universal language of clay. These tours, importantly, reframed Kwali's work within a broader Black Atlantic context, linking Nigerian crafted traditions to diasporic modernities. At some of the venues on tour, she was received not as an ethnographic curiosity, but as an artist in dialogue with African American ceramicists exploring identity and heritage, African and other Western ceramicists exploring identity and heritage. So, for example, the African American ceramicist Winnie Owens Hart was at a Ladi Kwali demonstration in the US, as was Ruth Duckworth when Kwali demonstrated outside of the Field Museum, the foyer of the Field Museum in Chicago. So this is another image that her family were quite keen to show me. The date is unknown. Ladi Kwali presenting a water pot to a military, I'm not sure who the military leader was at the time, just to give a sense of, on the other side, in the context of Nigeria, the ways in which she became well known and was an important figure at state events. Among the few objects preserved by her family are her MB medal and decorative roulettes, small carved wooden tools used to impress patterns on clay. Holding them, I was struck by how they collapsed time. The medal symbolizing imperial honor, the roulettes embodying intimate tactile knowledge. The tools are archives in themselves, repositories of gesture, touch, repetition. They carry her hand's memory more vividly than any written document could. And so just to give you a bit of a context of the surrounding area of where this archive is held, it's in the home of Ladi Kwali's family in Suleja. After leaving Kwali and Kwali town and joining the Pottery Training Center, she never returned back to her hometown. She spent the rest of her life in Suleja. A lot of her family members were speaking about the community and all of the relatives who ended up living with her at the time. I mean, it's in quite a urbanized part of the city. Suleja is pretty much a city now, and in quite a deprived part of the city. Buildings partly in ruin. Visiting this home with probably about 20 plus family members, and each of them taking the time to show me this archive of items, which they hope one day that this home and this site can become a sort of heritage site to see these works, which I had a private viewing of when I visited. Visiting the former Abuja Pottery Training Center in Suleja was sobering. The once celebrated kilns are now silent. Glazed rooms lie in partial ruin. Other structures partially reconfigured for a transformation project. An architect I spoke to who's been working with the Nigerian government on this project, backed by the World Bank, spoke to me about the project's continual starts and stops over the years. It's to be reimagined as a cultural tourism site, celebrating Ladi Kwali and other Abuja potters trained by Cardew, but more as a center for tourism and events, perhaps with the odd pottery demonstration. Potter's wheel preferred over hand building. Yet outside, on the journey there in surrounding villages, some women are still building and firing pots as their mothers did. The site embodies Nigeria's uneven relationship with its artistic heritage, proud commemoration of Kwali on one hand, material and continual infrastructural neglect on the other. So there's been some work going on here, really, for the last 20 years. Part of the original structures transformed into, I think what I gathered is to mainly have them as conference rooms and places that perhaps people can say. So there's a sort of hybrid architecture from Cardew's time in the 50s with more contemporary interpretations of the spaces. And this is part of a building, which was the sales room. It was a black and white image that I showed earlier on that has been like modified into a two-story building. But the site is in action. There's nothing happening there presently at the moment. Ladi Kwali is on the reverse of the 20 naira note in Nigeria, introduced in 2007, crystallizing this tension between visibility and silence. It immortalizes her, yet it also aestheticizes her. Kwali is depicted at the wheel, serene, industrious, maternal, embodying a national ideal of virtuous labor. Note that she is not hand-building. But Kwali was not merely industrious. She was experimental, perceptive, and subversive in her quiet way in this image. Her inclusion on the currency is both recognition and reduction, a reminder of how easily women's creativity is absorbed into symbols of nationhood. This is something that should be questioned, given that Kwali's works as I speak are not currently on public display in any Nigerian public or private museum or institution. And the Pottery Training Center, Suleja, renamed after her, still lies in part ruin and is non-functional. Across Nigeria, particularly in the capital region, Ladi Kwali's name circulates through geography. Ladi Kwali Street, Ladi Kwali Conference Center at Transcorp Sheraton Hilton, both in Abuja, Ladi Kwali Close in Suleja, and the Dr. Ladi Kwali Pottery Center in her hometown. The acts of naming affirm her symbolic importance, but also flatten her the complexity of her life. She risks being remembered as an emblem rather than a potter, ceramicist, an artist, part of Nigerian modernist discourse. A problem shared by many women whose labor becomes cultural heritage while their intellectual contributions are largely forgotten. And so it was really interesting visiting Kwali and Suleja and speaking to the family members. On the one hand, family members who are in Kwali, where this image was taken, her hometown. And the local government has built this pottery training center, or pottery center in her hometown. Introduced wheel throwing, hasn't had enough of governmental support to support it, so that doesn't happen there. Again, turning into something for public and civic use and completely disconnected from this hand building within the community where it emerged. And then you have the family in Suleja, which is her adopted hometown, who are also trying to create something like a heritage site within the context of the home that Ladi Kwali lived in. And it's almost as if, and the original pottery training center in Suleja in ruin, and it's almost as if there is a disconnect between what everybody's trying to do to preserve Ladi Kwali's legacy and not quite achieving that. And as I have described a little bit, this idea of Ladi Kwali as a symbol of local and national identity, but a bit of a disconnect with the hand building for which she became famous for. So this is an image of Ladi Kwali close just outside where she lives in Suleja. Ladi Kwali Street in Abuja, capital city. Ladi Kwali's grave in her family compound in Kwali is simple. It's a concrete slab surrounded by modest houses and her name, Dr. Ladi Kwali, etched onto the rectangular concrete frame. The family there also hopes one day people will make a pilgrimage and come to this site outside her childhood home. Standing there, I was reminded that while she's remembered as a national icon, much of her story remains local, carried by memory, not monument. Her legacy survives most vividly in the gestures of the few living potters and in the clay of Kwali itself. When I traveled to Kwali in 2023, I watched local potters repeat these same gestures, coiling, smoothing, firing, many of them working with clay to create a rhythm that guides their hands, the sound, the movement, the heat, all of it together forming a choreography for making in the Gbari hand-building tradition. This embodied knowledge connects generations. Pottery in this context is a living archive, a form of continuity that exists through repetition and through care. I met a new generation of women continuing her lineage. They spoke of her not as legend, but as ancestor. One potter named Kaka Ramatu said, "We sing celebrating her to remember how to continue to do this work." Watching them, I understood that Kwali's legacy is not static. It lives in the act of making itself, in rhythm, in repetition, and in resilience. So, sorry, I'll just go back and explain a little bit about some of these images. When I went to make the documentary in Kwali and Suleja, particularly in Kwali, I was welcomed with a reception of a couple of women in the town, intergenerational, who were building water pots. It was more sort of reception, demonstration situation. But I only came across 3 potters who were active. There was a lot of difficulty in trying to pass down the tradition to a younger generation. Most of the younger generation found the work very difficult, very hard. And also in terms of the economic context of Nigeria, a difficult way to earn a living. So it wasn't something that was being embraced by a younger generation. And so we moved across to villages close to Kwali in Piri, which is where this image is taken, with Kaka Aleri Luka. It's probably close to 90s, who had moved to this community by the roadside, actually, in Piri, where pots were being made on well, it was a mix of all sorts of things, hand-built pots, industrial pots being sold by the roadside and just making behind and putting it by the road as traffic was passing to sell her work. And she'd gone from, because of her age, not being quite able to make the larger vessels that she made in her youth and making these incense burners, which were a response to what was to the need locally. So this is what she's making in this image. And then in another community, sorry, the slide is wrong. It's actually called Piri. Aishatu Yusuf, where within the community, hand-built vessels were being used for a lot of herbal medicine. So that was fueling making these water pots and vessels for cooking, and a local industry being sustained that way because of use. And this is an image of Ramatu Suleiman demonstrating as the community welcomed me into Kwali on my first day. In 1977, Kwali was awarded an honorary doctorate from Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, an extraordinary honor for a woman with no formal education. A family photograph shows her in her full academic gown, composed, dignified, and beaming. The family also preserving not just this gown, but other personal effects, like the MB medal we saw and the Nigerian National Merit of Honor. It encapsulates her trajectory from village potter to national figure, from hand-built clay to cultural currency. The legacy of Ladi Kwali is not just in the pots and ceramics objects she left behind, but in the questions she continues to raise for us about ceramics, about art history and memory. As I conclude this presentation, I return to this thought as clay, of thinking of clay as an archive of and for transformation. It holds the trace of every hand that has touched it. Through Kwali's hands, it became a vessel for histories of women's labor, colonial encounter, and creative persistence. Her story reminds us that modernism was not imported wholesale from Europe. It was also shaped in places like Kwali and Suleja through the embodied intelligence of makers and artists who made it with what was at hand. And so, as we look again at her water pots, those rounded breathing forms, we see not only objects of beauty, but testaments to endurance. Each one holds water, each one held water, memory, and the world. Thank you. Okay. So we're just going to show, well, the documentary is 29 minutes, but we're going to show about 15 minutes of the documentary that I made I directed in 2023 with a Nigerian filmmaker, Adewale Dada, and members of Ladi Kwali's family in Suleja and in Kwali, her birth town, which informed this lecture.